The air in the control room still smelled of expensive espresso and cheap betrayal. Everyone stared at the folder, its typed label gleaming like a polished blade under the fluorescent lights. Innovation was supposed to save the facility, but it had just signed its death warrant. What happens when the savior turns out to be the saboteur? The hum of the automated assembly lines always sounded like a simulated heartbeat. It was clean, rhythmic, and utterly devoid of human warmth. In the center of the glass-walled control room, the holographic displays cast a cool, sapphire glow over the sleek, minimalist desks. It looked less like a manufacturing hub for defense-grade naval equipment and more like a high-end tech startup in Silicon Valley. Everything was optimized, streamlined, and digitized. Yet, beneath the glossy surface of the smart factory layout, a subtle, discordant vibration rattled the bones of the facility. The veterans noticed it, the engineers who remembered when quality was measured with micrometers rather than cloud-based predictive algorithms. To them, the air felt thin, stripped of the comforting, heavy scent of machine oil and hot steel. It had been replaced by the sterile ozone tang of overclocked servers and the artificial pine of industrial air purifiers. Julian Vance, the chief innovation officer, had arrived 6 months prior with a sleek leather briefcase, a vocabulary full of disruptive paradigms, and an absolute disdain for legacy processes. He treated the decades-old naval manufacturing traditions not as a foundation, but as an anchor, dragging the company down into obsolescence. He moved fast and broke things exactly as the tech manifestos prescribed. The problem with breaking things in military-grade manufacturing, however, is that the pieces tend to scatter across international waters. The legal team's conference room, situated 3 floors below the glowing heart of the control room, felt like a subterranean bunker. By 2 a.m., the long mahogany table was buried under mountains of dead trees. The digital revolution stopped the moment the Pentagon sent a formal inquiry. When the government audits arrived, they arrived on paper, sealed in heavy cardboard boxes that smelled of damp warehouses and institutional dread. Chief Counsel Victoria Sterling sat at the head of the table, her glasses reflecting the harsh, unyielding text of the Section 11 Military Compliance Review. Her fingers traced the edges of a particularly dense spreadsheet. Every line item represented a component intended for the propulsion systems of the new class of littoral combat ships. Every line item was flagged in aggressive digital red. He didn't just bypass the standard validation protocols, Victoria murmured, her voice carrying the dry, raspy exhaustion of someone who had consumed nothing but lukewarm black coffee for 18 hours. He systematically uninstalled them. He called them redundant bureaucratic friction. The junior compliance officer across from her didn't look up from his tablet. His face was pale, caught in the pale blue glare of a screen that kept refreshing with new discrepancies. It's worse than that, Victoria. Look at the software integration phase for the automated welding arrays. The algorithms were supposed to self-correct for thermal expansion. They didn't. They just ignored the sensor anomalies to keep the production velocity metrics looking pristine for the quarterly board report. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint, distant thrum of the factory floor above. The brilliant, forward-thinking strategy that had earned Julian a feature article in Modern Industrialist was unraveling into a textbook case of gross negligence. The state-of-the-art control room wasn't a cockpit guiding them into the future. It was a beautifully designed theater box where they had all watched a train wreck in slow motion. Victoria closed the heavy binder with a dull thud that echoed like a gavel. The realization was crystallizing in the quiet corners of the room. The innovation wasn't flawed. The innovation was a cover story. The real danger wasn't that the technology had failed, but that someone had intentionally calibrated it to hide the cracks until the ink on the defense contracts was completely dry. The true weight of a military audit doesn't hit you until you realize that every single line item carries a federal prison sentence. In the dim light of the legal bunker, the pages of the Section 11 review looked like an autopsy report for a ghost. The font was standard government courier, unemotional, rigid, and devastatingly precise. It detailed exactly how the automated assembly lines had systematically substituted aerospace-grade titanium with a highly optimized, cost-effective polymer matrix during the midnight shifts. Julian Vance had called it material agility. The Department of Defense, however, called it treasonous cutting of corners. Victoria stood up, her joints popping in the quiet room. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass that looked down into the dark, cavernous expanse of Warehouse 4. Below, row after row of crated naval components sat wrapped in heavy industrial plastic, waiting for a shipping fleet that would now never arrive. They looked like sarcophagi. This wasn't just a corporate crisis. This was a national security bottleneck. The entire Atlantic deployment schedule was tied to the contents of this room. "We checked the digital ledger," the junior compliance officer said, his voice cracking slightly as he rubbed his bloodshot eyes. The modifications to the stress testing parameters were all pushed through an anonymous administrator profile at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The IP addresses point to a rotating VPN. He thought he was completely invisible behind the cloud infrastructure. "Thought," Victoria repeated, a sharp, humorless smile cutting across her face. But Julian always forgot one basic rule of the old school. The military doesn't trust the cloud. They demand physical, handwritten cross-checks for every structural weld on a naval hull. She walked back to the table and picked up a weathered gray logbook, the kind with marbled covers and thick numbered pages that couldn't be deleted, wiped, or updated via a remote server. It was the manual backup kept by Master Chief Miller, the head welder who had been forced into early retirement 3 months ago for failing to adapt to digital synchronization workflows. As Victoria flipped through the pages, the contrast was staggering. On one side, Julian's digital dashboards showed 100% compliance and flawless thermal imaging. In the physical logbook, Miller's heavy blue ink handwriting told a completely different story. Microfractures detected in hull section Bravo. System overrode manual stop. Warning labels suppressed by admin command. Every single manual override, every suppressed warning, and every bypassed safety protocol in that physical book didn't have an anonymous IP address attached to it. Because it was an encrypted physical log tied to the old master control panel, it required a physical keycard authorization. The digital footprint was a ghost, but the physical lockbox recorded the truth. Every single violation, every shortcut taken to keep the sleek control room monitors glowing green was signed off by the exact same digital employee ID code, Julian's code. He had built a flawless digital illusion, completely forgetting that the physical world always leaves a physical dent. The door to the bunker clicked open, and the cold morning light began to bleed through the high windows of the facility. The illusion of the modern, self-correcting factory was completely shattered. They weren't looking at a technological evolution anymore. They were looking at a crime scene, and the culprit had left his fingerprints on every single weapon. The illusion of the flawless, digital factory has officially collapsed. When innovation bypasses accountability, the cost isn't measured in lost revenue. It's measured in systemic failure and compromised security. The investigation into the Section 11 military compliance review is widening, and the choices made in the next 12 hours will determine who survives the fallout. The morning shift arrived at 5:30 a.m., their boots clopping rhythmically against the polished concrete corridor like a marching platoon. They were completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had turned into a frozen lake of legal liability. In the control room, the primary servers began their morning cycle, whirring to life with a high-pitched, digital whine that sounded like an alarm nobody wanted to answer. Victoria Sterling stood by the main console, watching the data streams cascade down the central glass pillar. Now that she knew exactly where to look, the pristine metrics looked grotesque. It was like looking at a beautifully applied layer of makeup covering a terminal illness. The automated system was currently reporting that the cooling pumps for a nuclear-grade propulsion assembly were operating at peak efficiency. Yet, according to the physical schematics crumpled in her hand, the auxiliary intake valves hadn't even been delivered to the facility. "He's logging in," the junior compliance officer whispered, staring at his monitor from a hidden terminal beneath the primary desk. His fingers flew across his keyboard, setting up a passive data trap. He's not at his desk. He's accessing the core architecture via the Wi-Fi network from the executive parking garage. Julian wasn't coming in to face the music. He was trying to execute an emergency wipe of the administrative logs before the facility's mainframe synced with the Pentagon's secure network at 6 a.m. Through the panoramic glass of the control room, Victoria saw Julian's silver luxury sedan idling near the security gate. The taillights glowed like two angry red eyes in the gray dawn mist. On the monitor, a progress bar appeared. Deauthorization of manual backup logs. 12% completed. He was remotely rewriting the history of the factory floor, erasing Master Chief Miller's blue ink ghost from the machine's memory. Block the local access point, Victoria said, her voice dropping an octave into a tone usually reserved for courtrooms and executions. If I cut the connection completely, the system triggers an automatic security lockdown, the officer warned, his forehead glistening with sweat. It will freeze the entire assembly line mid-cycle. The thermal shock could warp the components currently in the curing ovens. Let it warp, Victoria said coldly. Better to ruin $10 million worth of steel today than to sink a naval vessel 3 years from now. The officer slammed his hand onto the emergency override macro. On the main holographic display, the tranquil blue interface instantly violently shifted into an aggressive, pulsing amber. The automated assembly lines below ground abruptly stopped with a synchronized mechanical groan that sounded like a dying beast. Outside, the brake lights of the silver sedan flared. Julian realized the network had died. The passenger door opened slightly, then hesitated, as if the occupant was weighing the difference between running and pretending it was all a technological glitch. He was caught between his digital arrogance and the sudden, terrifying reality of a physical trap closing around him. The silence that followed the factory's shutdown was heavier than any mechanical roar. Down on the floor, the giant robotic arms froze mid-arc, holding half-finished hull segments, like giant metallic predators, turned to stone. The sudden absence of the low-frequency hum made everyone's ears ring. In the control room, the amber warning lights cast long, rhythmic shadows across the faces of the remaining tech team. Julian didn't run. Men like Julian never run. They rely on their vocabulary to build a bridge out of the burning building. When the elevator doors slipped open with a soft, electronic chime, he stepped into the control room looking remarkably unbothered. His tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, his silk tie perfectly knotted despite the pre-dawn hour. He held an iPad under his arm like a shield, his face twisted into an expression of practiced, aristocratic annoyance. Victoria, what on earth is going on here? Julian asked, his voice echoing off the glass walls with a theatrical, commanding resonance. Do you have any idea what a total line freeze costs this company per minute? The board is going to have your head for this bureaucratic hysteria. Victoria didn't look up from the physical logbook. She slowly turned a page, the crisp paper making a sharp scratch in the quiet room. The line didn't freeze because of hysteria, Julian. It froze because we severed your remote connection from the parking garage. Julian's left eyebrow twitched, a microscopic fracture in his flawless corporate armor. He laughed, a light dismissive sound that fell flat against the heavy atmosphere. My connection? I was simply running a diagnostic sync before the morning briefing. The legacy database was lagging as usual. If your old-school IT department can't handle modern data loads, that's hardly an executive emergency. It wasn't a diagnostic sync, Victoria said. She finally raised her eyes, her gaze locking onto him with the chilly precision of a sniper. You were executing a script to delete the physical validation entries from the local cache. Specifically, the entries detailing the structural defects in the literal propulsion housings. Julian took a step forward, his posture shifting from annoyed executive to aggressive visionary. Those defects are statistical anomalies within an acceptable margin of digital error. Your outdated compliance metrics are strangling innovation. We are building the future of the Navy, Victoria. You can't bake a cake without breaking a few eggs. These aren't eggs, Julian. They are warships, Victoria replied, her voice dangerously calm. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slide-locking it across the sleek glass desk until it stopped right against his pristine iPad. And this is a federal freeze order signed by the Eastern District Magistrate 30 minutes ago. Julian glanced down at the document. The word subpoena was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink at the top, accompanied by the golden seal of the Department of Defense. For the first time, the color drained from his face, leaving him looking as sterile and pale as the artificial lights above him. The disruption was over. The litigation had begun. The golden seal on the subpoena seemed to absorb the remaining light in the control room. Julian's hand hovered over his iPad, his fingers trembling slightly before he slowly lowered it to the desk. The corporate vocabulary that had served as his armor for years, the words that had charmed boardrooms and silenced critics, had completely failed him against a single sheet of paper. "This is a misunderstanding," Julian whispered, his voice losing its theatrical resonance, replaced by a thin, desperate edge. "A systemic misinterpretation of modern development methodologies. If I can just present the optimization models to the committee—" "The committee isn't looking at models anymore, Julian," Victoria interrupted, her voice cutting through his defense like a diamond through glass. "They are looking at metallurgy. They are looking at the physical welds holding a $200 million hull together." She gestured to the junior compliance officer, who hit a final sequence on the master console. The glowing amber warnings vanished, replaced by a cold, monochrome display. It wasn't a sleek dashboard or a colorful chart. It was the raw, unedited system log from the factory's physical core, the master template of truth that no remote user could alter without a physical security key. Line by line, the terminal scrolled through the history of the project. Next to every single unauthorized material substitution, next to every bypassed quality check and suppressed warning, the system displayed a tiny, unblinking cryptographic signature. It wasn't an anonymous IP address or a generic admin profile. It was Julian's personal biometric encryption key, hard-coded into the facility's physical architecture during his first week on the job. "You thought the cloud would wash away your sins," Victoria said softly, closing the marbled logbook with a final, decisive thud. "But you forgot that when you build things for the real world keeps score. Every single violation had your signature. There is no algorithm that can rewrite that." Julian looked around the control room, his eyes darting from the monochrome screen to the frozen assembly line below, and finally to the glass doors, where two federal marshals in dark suits had just stepped out of the elevator. The silence that followed was absolute, the final, crushing weight of reality settling over the modern mirage. The innovation officer who had promised to drag the company into the future was led out into the cold morning air, leaving behind the sleek, silent machines and the old-school ledger that had brought him down.